All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is more than just a conversation about technology. It's a reflection on the power of digital transformation to protect, preserve, and elevate the voices that have shaped our history. As communities across the U.S. continue to confront challenges around equity, access, and representation, this webinar offers a timely look at how to use innovative digital tools to safeguard legacies and the broader civil rights movement. Oops. Apologies, everyone. For today's webinar, through presentations from Dr. Graves and Terentia's founder and CEO, Neil Bilo, polls, open discussion, and Q&A will explore how institutions take meaningful steps to preserve underrepresented histories, build sustainable digital infrastructures, and ensure future generations have access to the stories that matter most. Please feel free to contribute to the conversation in the chat and put any questions that you have in the Q&A. We will get to those questions towards the end of the webinar. And of course, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kelisha B. Graves, Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Dr. Graves leads the King Center's educational and archival initiatives. She has been instrumental in the King Center's recent digital transformation, one of the most significant efforts to digitize civil rights history in the United States. Dr. Graves is joined by Terentia's founder and CEO, Neil Bilo. With over 20 years of DAM industry experience and a passion for cultural institutions, Neil founded Terentia to empower GLAM institutions to break down silos, bring collections out from the storage, and make them more accessible through an innovative cloud-native hybrid solution. And I'm Alex Cron, Community Manager for Terentia. I work closely with Terentia's growing community to foster collaboration, share insights, and facilitate conversations on how our technology can be used to uplift underrepresented voices and strengthen collective memory. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Neil to talk more about Terentia, and he will be followed by Dr. Graves.
Thanks, Alex. And again, we'd love to remind people, feel free to jump into the chat and say where you're from, introduce yourself. It's always fun to see where people are from all around the world. I am privileged today to be here with Dr. Graves, and we at Terentia feel very privileged to be supporting the King Center as their system of record for their very important archive, as well as their digital preservation system here today. We feel very honored again to be working on such an important subject, as well as to help preserve and protect things, and have a lot of gratitude to the King Center for their trust in us in becoming their repository. So we're very grateful for this. Excited for what Dr. Graves' presentation. For those who've not had a chance to see a Dr. Graves presentation, she's one of the best out there when it comes to it. So we're pretty excited for her to be showing things today. All right, next slide. For those who don't know about Terentia, we have this concept of that stands on 4 pillars. How do we think about managing the content? So there's your classic digital asset management, but also collections management. We've done this system where we're able to bring together dams, collections, archives, libraries, rights, licensing, and being able to create and allow for the discovery of content amongst all of these systems, as well as create engagement tools. Something you're going to hear Dr. Graves talk a little bit about. How do we publish, create exhibitions, share, and then the next part that we're working on is our trade component. So how to go beyond rights and licensing. And one of the big things that we're working on with the King Center and others includes how can we help you generate some revenue through rights and licensing or other activities that you're doing to create those frictionless e-commerce opportunities with our cultural institutions. At this point, I think, Alex, we're going to hand it over to Dr. Graves for the amazing presentation that she has.
Thank you, Neil.
Excellent. Can I be heard?
Absolutely, you can.
Wonderful. Good day, everyone. I say good day because certainly I hope that it is one wherever you are in the world. Always grateful for our we traditional word might be partners, but I like to say our family members at Terentia for walking lockstep with the King Center on our digital transformation journey. It is my pleasure to be able to share with you all about that today. Alex, if you can confirm that you can see my screen in full screen mode.
Yep, you're good to go.
Very good. Thank you. So, as Neil and his team mentioned, my name is Kelisha Graves. I serve as the Chief Research, Education, and Programs Officer at the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And what that means is that I get to work with a wonderful group of people to design learning journeys for people all over the world. Certainly, on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Bernice A. King, we are always grateful for the opportunity to share. So let's talk a little bit about who are we at the King Center. Our vision at the King Center, we envision a beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And that vision is operationalized through what we see as a quite robust mission to empower people to create a more just, equitable, and peaceful world by applying Dr. King's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. The pillars that we use to move that work along are research, education, and training. There are 6 areas under my purview at the King Center. The area which is of particular interest to this community is, of course, the King Library and Archives. You will forgive me in advance for being a professor, but I must provide a guide for our journey today so that we can walk lockstep. So our journey today, I'm going to talk a little bit about our origin story at the King Center. Also, we're going to talk about navigating the challenges of digitizing the King Library and Archives. We're also going to talk about our metadata and digital strategy, and then we'll talk about long-term sustainability. So our origin story, I often like to say that our origin story begins in the powerful imagination of a woman who believed that she could use her life for constructive social change. That woman is none other than certainly the one, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, who was the wife and widow of Martin Luther King Jr. However, at the King Center, we herald Mrs. King, if you will, as the architect of the King legacy. So not only was she the wife of Dr. King, but Mrs. King is chiefly responsible for what we understand today to be the institutionalization of the King legacy. Not only that, Mrs. King was a trailblazer in terms of being a preservationist. So from early on, she had an intention to preserve the history and artifacts, not only related to her husband's life, but certainly the broader civil rights movement. A lot of people don't know that as a student, Mrs. King had a background, in fact, being engaged in libraries. And so it should be no surprise then that she, after Dr. King's death, she was really intentional about formalizing an institutional archive. So when you think about the King Library and Archives, if we take a genealogical view, our archive actually began, I would say, as early as the 1950s when Mrs. King begins a personal documentation project of Dr. King's papers and the important moments associated with his life. Why do I say that? Because when the Montgomery bus boycott happened, 1955 to 1956, it was during Dr. King's first public address as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Mrs. King was the one who said, record this moment because this is going to be significant for history. So Mrs. King was instrumental even in the mid 50s in terms of understanding that her husband's life was not only going to have exponential impact, but that impact would need to be packaged in the form of collecting his records and documents that would ultimately become an institutional archive. So when we think about our timeline, you have the King Center, which is founded a couple of weeks after Dr. King's assassination in 1968. The King the MLK Library is established in July 1968. But of course, you have again this longer initiative that stretches back to the 1950s, where Mrs. King is personally collecting her husband's papers, speeches, and the artifacts associated with his life. And so we had the formation of after the founding of the King Center, you have the Library Documentation Project, which was designed around collecting the records and recollections of not only Dr. King and those who knew him in the broader civil rights movement. This is important from a narrative shaping perspective, because when you look at the African American experience in America in particular, it had been articulated through a particular Eurocentric white lens. And so it was important for Mrs. King to do a lot of that grassroots work in terms of collecting and preserving the artifacts of significance to the African American community, so that those people could tell their own stories. So the materials and assets that kind of make up the archive, it's a combination. We have the largest collection in the world of primary source material related to Dr. King and the American Civil Rights Movement. So you're talking about film and books and manuscripts, articles, personal papers, news clippings. I mean, it runs the gamut in terms of the different types of materials that we have in our archive. So when we think about the significance of Mrs. King's efforts around the Library Documentation Project, what she did was collect and amass, if you will, a treasure trove, a volume of contents, a massive volume of contents that enables us today to think about different experiences that we can offer people all around the world. And so that brings me to talk about navigating the challenges of digitizing the King Library and Archives. As I mentioned earlier, we have the largest repository in the world of primary source material related to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, naturally, as having this large repository of materials, you certainly have a complexity of different formats and asset types. We have handwritten documents, which, in some cases are very fragile. We have photographs, that need to be color corrected, carefully labeled. We have audio-visual assets. In fact, we have over 800,000 minutes of audio-visual content that has been digitized to date. And of course, a lot of these are in formats that are no longer used today, and they require migration. We also have artifacts, so personal effects and memorabilia that certainly need 3D digitization and contextual documentation. And so the complexity of these formats means then that we have to carefully think about what preservation looks like for all of these different formats and types of assets. So how do we balance preservation and access? So for us, as for most cultural heritage institutions, digital transformation really is a balancing act between preserving the integrity of the item, but not only that, ensuring and supporting and enhancing public access to these materials. And so some of the questions that have been of importance to us have been, how do we protect the most sensitive materials? How do we ensure equitable access? And so when we think about equity from an archival standpoint, we're thinking about it beyond the traditional scholar researcher lens. It is the expectation and indeed the trend for scholars and researchers to be most interested in archives, right? As a person who is in academia, who has published works, who has written books, I am naturally inclined and drawn to archives. And most of the time when I go to libraries, there are people who are researchers and scholars, just like particularly archive researchers and scholars, just like myself. But when we think about archives from an equity lens, the question that we're motivated to answer and indeed find a solution to is, how do we ensure that our collections become accessible to all? So we think about equity from a broad view. And then the other question we've had to wrestle with is, how do we build a digital infrastructure that is future ready? So some examples of how we balance preservation and access. We have here some examples which are publicly available via our digital exhibitions of some of our audiovisual assets from the King Library and Archives digitized audiovisual collection. So we have preservation copy, which is a JPEG 2000, which, it's a preservation copy. We don't mess with it. It's there. However, we also have an access copy or a proxy copy, which is stream ready and which is in an MP4 format. And that's because we have to service research requests. We have digital exhibitions that we mount in make available to the public, and it is not conducive for a video, which is 300 gigabytes, to be stream ready. So we have an access copy version that ensures that when we're, again, mounting exhibits or servicing research requests, that we have a format that is ready to be shared, thereby maximizing accessibility of the content. Talking a little bit now about our metadata and our digital strategy. Quite a few metadata complexities when we think about our collection. Of course, quite naturally, I don't have to tell this crowd this, but metadata certainly is how people find things, right? It's the data about data. And so when you think about a collection that is as historically rich and dense as the King Library and Archives, it's not just about finding items, but understanding those items or archival resources. And so our challenge is not just about organizing our items, but how do we appropriately contextualize our items so that we can help people understand what these archival artifacts meant at the time and why it still matters today. So contextualization is very important to us. And so again, just to kind of give you some scope, our materials span decades, formats, multiple authors and contributors. So we have hundreds of thousands of items, millions, in fact, in terms of our collection. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we take a broad view to equity and accessibility. So metadata considerations. One of our primary considerations is how do we ensure contextual and cultural validity? And this is something we're still working through. Now, disclaimer, the photo that I am going to describe on the screen, the metadata on the screen does not reflect the actual facts of this photo. This is just an example. Of course, we know the photo on the screen is of Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine during that civil rights during that civil rights movement in Little Rock, Arkansas. So I just wanted to preface this, that the facts, this is just an example. So the metadata is not related to the actual facts of this photo. But let's say, you know, we're digitizing a photo of a young Black girl that's integrating a previously all-white school. A traditional framework, you know, you have the title that might say unidentified girl entering into a school. The date, 1957, location, Arkansas, format, black and white, subject, desegregation. However, we're really interested in understanding how do we move toward a values-driven, justice-centered metadata framework that ensures contextual and cultural validity. So when we think about what does that look like applied to in a metadata sense, you have the title, right? Perhaps the title could be Courage in Motion, Young Black Girl Integrating Segregated School, as opposed to Unidentified Girl Entering a School. When you think about the subjects, thinking about the keywords associated with this artifact. So rather than just desegregation or civil rights, you may have terms like youth leadership, racial justice, Black girlhood, other keywords that can help people across the spectrum find this particular archival asset. Other keywords, you know, bravery, education, equity, erasure, memory, historical invisibility. I can certainly say as a professor who I teach, one of the courses I teach is history and philosophy of education. A lot of the terms my students use are education, equity, erasure, memory. And if we don't account for those keywords in a metadata context, then we edit the ability for researchers across the spectrum, right, potentially to be able to find these assets. So we're really thinking about contextual and cultural validity. Metadata consideration 2, context is king. So thinking in terms of time and themes. One of our core strategies is to organize content not only by date and format, but certainly by themes and historical moments. What do I mean? A sermon delivered by Dr. King in 1963, it isn't just a speech, but it's part of, in fact, a broader theme. So how do we think about artifacts and documents and audiovisual material in a broader thematic context, so that a speech delivered by Dr. King in 1963 is not simply a speech, but is part of a broader thing that could be titled Faith and Freedom Movement. You think about photographs of marches, right? This isn't just visual content, but really it connects to themes like youth leadership, nonviolent resistance, women in the movement. So again, thinking about how we can think about metadata in a thematic, in a broader thematic and contextual kind of context. So I developed this metadata discovery kind of framework because I was thinking about how do we build a framework for relevance. And one of the kind of, there's three pillars to this, thinking about time sensitive. So in recognizing that, you know, the historical artifacts that we're working with are have particular chronological significance, but also thinking about in terms of our metadata framework, theme based, right? Aligning items with broader civil rights and social justice themes. So like I mentioned before, speech of Dr. King from 1963 is not simply a speech, but it's within a broader thematic movement that could be labeled faith and the freedom struggle, if you will. But also theme based, thinking about this from a theme based context allows us to think about how do we map our archival content to curriculum. As a teacher, I'm always thinking about what are the different educational resources that are available that I can use to empower my classroom. And so a lot of my research is thematic based. So when I'm teaching my course on history and philosophy of education, a lot of the keywords I'm using when I'm searching for content is theme-based. So ensuring that our metadata and discovery framework has a theme-based component as well, but also as we think about this, ensuring that our assets are application ready. So whether it's educators or filmmakers or scholars, activists, they can easily apply these materials in their own work. Thinking now about long-term sustainability, partnerships is incredibly important to us at the King Center. It's how our work moves forward. We've been quite fortunate to be able to partner with Microsoft over the last couple of years to support the implementation and the advancement, if you will, of our digital transformation. Terentia is an incredible partner, of course, our system of record as it relates to our digital asset management system and our collections engagement system. So we're building strategic partnerships across sectors to help support our archival innovation initiatives. So, wanted to mention, we have here on the screen some of the digital exhibitions. I'll talk a little bit about it in the end. I encourage all of you all to engage these exhibitions because, again, it's a representation of how we're amplifying our archival collections to the world. So we also think about the power of technology to advance this concept that I'm calling archival justice. And so our North Star when we think about our archives is archival justice, and how archival justice is powered through technology, or if you might term it technology for social good. And so we have to have an operational definition for what archival justice is. So I see archival justice as the democratization of archival collections by ensuring not only preservation, but participation. And not just participation for a narrow group of people, but participation at scale. So what do I mean? Participation in terms of education, participation in terms of research, participation in terms of public engagement. So again, as I mentioned earlier, our view of equity and accessibility when it comes to archives is very broad because we are interested in, of course, preservation as a priority, but also how do we ensure that we galvanize participation as it relates to our collection? Because it serves no one if archival collections are just in a basement collecting dust. They have to be pushed out to the world because it helps to create awareness in society. It helps to inform movement. It helps to inform changes. And so it's critically important that when we're thinking about archives, at least my argument would be that we think about it from an archival justice lens so that our archival assets and items have value beyond the staff that simply cares for them, right? So preservation and participation are certainly our two biggest priorities. I invite you all to certainly see the manifestation of this. Again, when we think about archival participation, partnerships is key. We've been able to partner with Microsoft to make available several digital exhibitions. So we have certainly the Coretta Scott King Rose Gallery, which is a 3D gallery focused on the life and legacy of Coretta Scott King. So the address is here, cskrosgallery.thekingcenter.org. Also encourage you all to visit the King Center Timeline, which is a linear-based digital exhibition that was developed in partnership with Terentia, which outlines the history and impact of the King Center. And again, it's an interactive exhibit. Again, another demonstration of how we are encouraging public engagement with our archival collections. When we think about education, archives also powerfully inform education. The King Library and Archives was particularly instrumental in the development of our online masterclass. So we were able to develop Nonviolence 365 online, which we would dare argue is the world's first online self-paced experience in Kingian nonviolence. And it's about a 16 to 18-hour experience. But the Library and Archives was instrumental in terms of providing contextual validity to this experience, but also surfacing and understanding what are the artifacts that need to be a part of this educational experience. Again, another example of educational experience, we recently partnered with EverFi and the NFL to launch Nonviolence for Social Change, which is a nonviolence course for young people, which is accessible to all teachers, and it's tailored for grades 8 through 12. But again, another example of how we're using the influence of archives to inform these educational experiences. And of course, you can go to the King Center's website as well to check out our educational resources, which is a guide that brings together, again, this thrust of how do we enhance participation with our archives, but also what we do. So in this educational guide, you'll find our digital exhibitions, you'll find our curricular resources, and our other learning-based opportunities that can help to advance the understanding of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And also, we are preparing to launch a new experience soon, we tentatively scheduled for spring of 2026. But we're now working on a new project in collaboration with Terentia, where we are going to bring together the power of film with cutting edge interactivity. So we'll be using artifact triggered touch points to unlock an exhibit that unfolds as you watch the film. So we're working on a docu-series, and again, we'll have these artifact triggered moments that will unlock an exhibit as you watch the film. And this not only allows viewers to watch history again, our North Star is educational justice, and central to that is preservation and participation. So this experience is really going to allow viewers to not just watch history, but to interact with it in real time. And so that concludes my presentation. I'll hand it back to my friends at Terentia.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share now.
I loved it. Like always, can you see me smiling this big? It's that bad. Like, you loved it. Like always incredibly inspiring to listen to you speak, Dr. Graves.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Graves, for sharing your time, insight, and expertise in our webinar today. Your leadership in preservation and digitization at the King Center is both really inspiring and deeply impactful. And I mean, especially to me, and I mean, I love that archival justice. We're going to make that popular. Thank you for highlighting the importance of, protecting underrepresented histories and for reminding us how digital innovation can serve a greater purpose, honoring the past while shaping a more equitable future. Lauren, if you could go ahead and launch our first poll before we go into our open discussion and Q&A. We'd love to hear from the audience with a few polls. Now I can't see if the poll has launched, unfortunately.
It has.
Okay, thank you, Neil. As stewards of cultural heritage and knowledge, our institutions play a powerful role in shaping, the historical record. In the digital age, that responsibility extends to how we represent communities online, particularly those that have been historically underrepresented or excluded. So we'd love to hear how well do you think your institution's representing historically underrepresented communities in its digital collections? Of course, this collection isn't about, perfection. It's about progress, awareness, intentionality. And unfortunately, I can't see the poll results, so it's going to be a
I can.
surprise for me. But
Yeah, so there's definitely been a lot of really great people attention to the poll, which is really great. With it, we'll keep it open for a little bit longer. I think maybe another 5-10 seconds until we
yeah,
get to the
excellent.
next one.
Yeah, everybody's responses are going to help, spark a deeper conversation around access, equity, and the role that digital collections play in preserving inclusive narratives for future generations.
Now, because we can see certain things on this, if anybody would just like to throw in the chat, whether or not can you see the poll results in the chat as they're live? I know Kelisha, you and I can.
Yes.
I'm curious if anybody who's watching or participating in our webinar today can just throw something in the chat. Thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate that for it. So thank you. No, so Alex, since you can't. It looks
Yeah.
like we've had 24 people respond right now, as in total, 7 saying very well, 11 saying somewhat well, 5 with not well, and 1 with not at all.
Okay.
So maybe let's go on to the next poll.
Yeah, thank you for that, Neil. Lauren, if you'd launch the second poll. So, as you know, making collections more accessible digitally and physically is a goal that many institutions share. But the path to achieving that is often filled with a lot of real world challenges that go beyond, just good intentions. So, what are the biggest challenges your institution's facing in making its collections more accessible? And of course, if you don't see your challenge listed in the poll, please feel free to put it in the chat. And Neil, if you could be so kind to go through the
Absolutely.
results.
I feel like I'm calling a horse race here along the way. And in the lead, we have. This is one of the biggest challenges that we actually find with a lot of cultural institutions who call us actually on a daily basis, which is why we're inspired by this, have created the small museum or small cultural institution initiative, understanding how much that not everybody has these large budgets to do things or and opportunities. We've been working very hard at Terentia. How do we create and give us a select amount, because we can't do it with everybody, but a select amount of people, our technology at a lot more of an inexpensive price to try and help lift voices of, if you will. Some of those include the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, which we'll be talking about in the future. For those who don't know, it's a great civil rights museum in Knoxville, Tennessee, Crissack in California, the Placer County museums, and a few others as well. We should probably even drop the link to the Placer County case study. We'll grab that and pass it on for those who are interested to hear more about our small museum initiative. All right, coming up here. So we had 23 coming in, with 17 with limited funding.
Yeah.
With it, 13 at lack of digital infrastructure, 4 with institutional policies, 9 with a lack of staff training, and 2% with others. With it, with people looking forward to hear more about about all of this. Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Lauren, why don't we go ahead and launch that last poll?
All right. And Lauren, thank you for dropping the link to the Placer County.
Yes, thank you. So improving access for underrepresented communities isn't just about expanding collections. It's about rethinking how we share those stories, who gets to tell them, and how people find and engage with them. And we very much would be interested in hearing what steps your institution has taken to improve access for those underrepresented communities. Whether you're prioritizing the digitization of marginalized voices, building partnerships, refining your metadata, or expanding language accessibility. And of course, if you're in the early stages, you're not alone. Many cultural institutions are there as well.
Dr. Graves, Sarah made a really interesting comment I thought maybe you and I could talk about, which was the consciousness of the digital footprint. And then therefore, how much do you digitize as part of your archives? I know you gave some amazing stats, but do you mind throwing out some of those stats again about just how large? And then I'd like to just jump in on the environmental impact of all of those.
Yeah, sure. So we have millions of documents. If this gives you any kind of scope, one of our collections is the equivalent of about 8 football fields.
Wow.
That's just one collection. I can't recall right now how many linear feet that is, but
Yeah.
that kind of gives you an idea of the amount of content we're working with. Right now, what's primarily digitized is our audio-visual collection, and that's I believe it's about 829,000 minutes of content there. And
Wow.
so you think about our audiovisual collection in relation to our broader archive. I mean, it's probably about 10% of everything that would eventually probably need to be digitized. So, yeah.
What's really
Incredible.
important about all of this is as a cloud native solution, which is what we have at Terentia and working with the King Center, is that we've been able to utilize archive level storage, but still allow for all of this to be accessible, which means that we've reduced the cost dramatically for maintaining these large collections online. And then secondly, we've been able to offer through our partnership again with Microsoft, where we are a cloud native application, it allows for 3 copies to be made of everything, which means that we're checking all the time for bit rot automatically, and then we're able to keep it off into a lower tier storage while still making the proxies of everything available while needed, which is what's really important, so that people can access them from the King Center and do some of the other amazing things with it. And why that's important is that, again, our commitment to the environment and thinking about that digital footprint with it. So having systems that can turn off and on as required, so that they're not just sitting there humming all the time, is really incredibly important. Closing down this last poll, because I can see it, Alex, I know you can. What steps is your institution taking to improve? So we had 7 people saying prioritizing the digitization of marginalized voices. 5 at partnering with communities to tell their stories. 9 improving metadata and culturally responsive descriptions. Kelisha, a really big one that you talked about, which is so important. Expanding language accessibility in the collections, and we haven't started yet, but we want to. That's exactly it. We need to keep on moving forward on this. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the polls. Your input adds a really valuable perspective to the conversation and helps us better understand the collective challenges and goals across our community. We really do appreciate your engagement, and we'll continue the conversation in our open discussion. So we're going to go ahead and kick off our open discussion and then Q&A, and I do have a couple questions of my own that I would like to ask. Dr. Graves, I'd love to hear more about, any advice that you'd like to give, institutions developing metadata frameworks for civil rights or archives that are focused on social justice.
Yeah, I think it's important for institutions, and this is something we did with Terentia early on, and we're still working on it. I think it's important for institutions to have vocabulary lists that are relevant to the cultural context of whatever the collections are that they're working with. Those vocabulary lists will enable you to be able to capture some of those significant keywords that would be helpful to apply to the archival items so that they can be found and discoverable. And our approach, of course, to kind of cultivating our vocabulary list was to speak directly with people who were involved in the civil rights movement, people who knew Dr. King and Mrs. King. That was absolutely critical. I think it's one thing to talk to scholars or for information workers to assume that they know all of the, potential vocabulary that could be associated, but we thought it was also important to take a grassroots approach as well, to crowdsource, if you will, the knowledge. I think when you talk about cultural heritage institutions, what makes us distinct is our focus on cultural heritage. And because of that focus, you have access to a repository of cultural knowledge that can be accessed to help to enhance one's institution or one's archival data. So I think taking a crowdsourcing approach, which is something that we did at the center, because fortunately for us, there's still, quite a few people who are still living who knew Dr. King, who knew Mrs. King, who also were able to give us insight on title changes. We have world leaders and presidents who, come to the King Center still. Recently, we hosted the King, His Majesty, the King of the Netherlands, King Wilhelm. We also hosted His Excellency, Dr. Ruto, who's the president of Kenya, recently, right? At the King Center, we've also hosted both former President Biden as well as Vice President Harris. So we have world leaders who come to the King Center all the time. However, what's important to capture is that sometimes their visits, and one of the things at the King Center, we are obsessive about capturing content. And so we have a lot of born digital content as well. So we're always, ensuring that we document these moments. But when these people visit, sometimes they have different titles, right? So let's say, as an example, we may have a former senator who visited, and now that former senator is president. And in our archives, you'll have Senator so-and-so, President so-and-so, same person, different titles. And so the importance of crowdsourcing that knowledge is important, especially when you talk about, for instance, the former Queen of the Netherlands, Queen Beatrice, who was the mother of His Majesty King Wilhelm, came to the King Center back in the, I believe it was the 70s or early 80s, and met with Mrs. King, right? So the mother, Queen Beatrix, came, and then the son comes, 40 or 50 years later. And it was important to be able to have one of our archival team members has been working with the King family since about 1965 or something like that. And so, she's able to give us insight to say, oh yeah, this person visited, they were so-and-so when they visited, and now they have a different title. So again, that was a long way to say, I think an important approach or piece of advice I might have is to crowdsource the knowledge and then apply that to your collections.
Absolutely. Neil, are we getting any questions in the Q&A? I didn't want to go too far into my list of questions
I didn't see any. I didn't see any yet, but I think that's been actually one of the most interesting things has been, how do we design a schema that allows for you to both keep the consistent as well as the alternatives, right? So for using your example of Biden, for example, where Biden was a vice president versus the president, so that when you're looking for either that vice president or you can have those alternative titles because they changed, and being able to create those as components so that they're searchable and they remain searchable, and you can see almost that history of Biden inside of the King Center's archive, I think is really incredibly important.
And same with Dr. King. Dr. King is known by so many different. You have Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You have MLK. And then of course you have the Michael, right? Because people understand that at one point his name. So you have that as well. That has to be associated. So if somebody types in, not that they would, but Michael King, you're able to still find the relevant information.
Yeah. Now, Alex, there are some questions coming in. It turns out the Q&A tab might not be working. We apologize for that. Okay. So please feel free to drop them into the regular chat. And I know, Alex, you can't see it, so I'm going to help you out here.
Thanks, Neil.
We'll start with the first one, which was, my museum has not begun the process of digitizing our archives or objects. How do we begin? Kelisha, what would you say is the first step? You guys took some of those first steps, right?
Yeah, that's an apropos question. So I think it's important to understand what are the materials that are most urgent in terms of being digitized, what are the most at-risk materials. For us, it was certainly our audio-visual collections, particularly, we have some film canisters that are 50 or 60 years old. And because, our vendor who we have working with us to do this digitization informed us about this because, of the change in climate. what they're seeing is the rapid deterioration of some of these older formats. And so that was something that was quite interesting to us as well. So we organize in alignment with a couple of priorities. First, what are the most at-risk materials and how do we get those digitized and migrated? And fortunately, we were able to do that. And then the second thing is funding. Funding makes a big difference in determining what can get done when. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, regarding partnerships, it's very important for cultural heritage institutions to be aggressive with establishing partnerships, because as you all know, digitization is expensive, right? And so we need it. In order for us to be able to do that, it became for us a development priority. So if your organizations have development offices or fundraising arms, it's important that this is a line item, if you will, in the grand scheme of their development priorities, because it has to have targeted, designated funding. And it's so unique. And so there's also an important storytelling component as well, because sometimes funders may not always understand what's the value of an archive, which is why that public engagement piece, whenever I want to demonstrate the value of why funding is necessary to help us digitize A, B, C, or D collection, all I have to do is say, hey, look at the King Center timeline. Look at this 3D Coretta Scott King Rose Gallery, where you can literally walk around the halls of the museum and interact with these artifacts. This is the kind of public benefit that can be yielded from your investment in our institution. So I think having a development plan around this is super important. And then also, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's the actual, but I think that's the key thing, right? A lot of times we think about the archive, and that is incredibly important, the archive of it, the digital preservation. But I think one of the key things that we've been working on with you and with others in the community, although led a lot by the King Center, is how do we then take it out of the archive to do more with it? How do we get people to to find it? And how do we go beyond just simple search of a website? But how do they become engaged with it? Which is why we're always excited to be working with you. I can't wait to be talking about our next generation tool of that digital exhibition to be able to bring this out. Alex, I'm going to keep going on here, but for those who don't know, I also dropped in. No, Dr. Graves, I don't think you guys use this potentially yet. I dropped in one source, which is Clear. We actually gave them a spot to speak at our Henry Stewart Dam and Museums Conference. You can also find that, I think, on our website for it. But the CLEAR program is a great one for recordings at risk, which is why we want to bring that up. And that's eligible for both Canada and the US for those who are interested with it. It's a non-government grant. I believe it's funded by the Mellon Foundation, but you can find out more. If you want any more information about that, feel free to reach out to us and we'll direct you to the right people as well. Okay. Another question came in, Dr. Graves. They said, what system did you have before Terentia? Was it easy to migrate everything?
Yeah, so transparently, we did not have a system before Terentia. We were using any number of random storage systems to store our files, and we did not have a dedicated location for our archival preservation, which was paramount, because we kind of just jumped out there and started, digitizing, and then we realized, oh gosh, we have to have a house for these digital assets to live. And I think that's something we don't always put together. We think about digitization and we don't think about the house where these items or art assets have to live. And so it's important for us to marry our ambition with infrastructure. And Terentia, through our partnership with Microsoft, was able to come alongside us and provide that digital infrastructure that we needed. So we were not organized in terms of from an archival standpoint around where we maintained our assets. But now, of course, through partnership with Terentia, we've been able to solve for that.
So jumping in just on top of that, at Terentia, we are experienced with migrating people from various systems, whether they be systems that include FileMaker or, quite honestly, which we have done, various collections management systems, archive systems, and other dams. We're able to bring, we have developed methodologies to do this. We've also developed methodologies to allow you to leverage your legacy systems. So a lot of times where you may have multiple systems in your environment and you're looking to replace, but you are trying to figure out a way to aggregate, to create relationships between all of this information and then get into engagement, we can also, work with those kind of things. And then for those who are small, again, we would encourage you to reach out and learn more about our small museum initiative, where maybe we might be able to help with that as well. Okay.
There's a question, Neil. I'm wondering if you don't mind if I answer. The person mentioned they had been affiliated with the Mandela Washington program. Let me just say I have a soft spot for that program. I hosted fellows through the Mandela Washington Fellowship. But your question is a very important one around, my question is for upcoming organizations going into preservation of cultural identity preservation, what would be your advice towards starting with limited resources? As I mentioned before, partnerships is key. So having an eye toward who are the partners that we may want to source to help us with this work. But also you can start very simply with the King Center, of course, founded in kind of a grassroots tradition. We run oral history projects on a regular basis, but also you don't need massive production teams to do. And this is just one aspect of preservation, right? You don't need massive production teams to do an oral history project. You have your cell phone, right? iPads where you can interview people in your community and capture their stories and preserve those. So those would be two initial points. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. For it. Okay, let's see what else we have on here. Do you see any other questions we haven't answered, Dr. Graves? I felt there's one about usability of Terentia, so I feel weird asking that question. It feels like a leading question, but I'm gonna let you go ahead and read that question. I feel like it's too leading for it.
Absolutely. So is Terentia, the question
and
is,
I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna pretend like I can't hear your answer.
So is Terentia user-friendly for trained archivists, or does it require some special training to become accustomed to using it, especially considering the customization features? What I will say is that the learning curve for us was in fact quite small. I found the system to be user-friendly. I am a digital native. I like a lot of white space on my screens, and I can say maybe it's a minor thing, but Terentia has a lot of white space, so it doesn't feel cluttered. But also, not only that, we have a digital asset administrator through Terentia that works directly with us, because we don't have on staff someone that manages specifically our digital archives. So we do have a DAM administrator that we work with at Terentia. So whether it's, uploading or whatever it is, the Terentia team is right there to kind of walk with us lockstep on, to meet whatever objectives we had. But I will say that's a benefit, because there are probably some systems you can buy where they just kind of throw you out there and you have to learn how to use it. But fortunately, Terentia doesn't desert or orphan Terentia doesn't orphan their partners. They walk lockstep with you. And I would have to say, Neil didn't pay me to say this, but it really is attributed to Neil's leadership. I mean, the kind of customer service or customer first mindset that Neil has and the passion that he has for cultural heritage, and indeed his whole team, it really spills over into our day-to-day engagement. So I found Terentia to be not only user-friendly, but friendly in general.
Appreciate that, Dr. Graves. One thing I'll add to this is it's why we don't charge for training. So there was a question about that. These systems are complicated at times for them, although what we've done is made them so that you don't need a developer. So there's no developers needed to do any of the work that they're doing. But we also, as part of our implementation and ongoing package, offer free training. That's right. I did say that. I have a belief that if systems are charging you for training, especially if you have to pay for it annually, that means that they're never going to be designed in a way to make it easier for you to use them. because that becomes a revenue center for them. For us, because we're offering it as part of this entire package, it is always in our thought process on how do we make the system easier for you to use? How do we continue to make sure that it's intuitive? So it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter, what your skill level is. It should be something you do, similar to Google, right? So you should be able to use it pretty intuitively. There's people with a lot more advanced skills, of course. And then on that whole configuration, that's why we're there to help you through that process and set up, because we have a schema of the system, which means that we can handle dinosaurs and live species like we can do actually at the Molten Marine Laboratory in our system. At the same time, we can also offer the King Center, or we can do art history or any of the other collections that we have inside of our archive and collection system with it. So we're really proud of that, because it can handle any schema. For those who are familiar with archive schemas, for example, we can handle both ISEG, DAX, as well as the new records in context, all within the same system, or at the same time if you even wanted to, although most people don't do that, but also separately, so we can build all of those very, very easily with it. So records in context is one of the newest ones as well. All right. There was another question from Sarah. What was the training process like for such a large project? I think maybe we did touch a little bit upon that with the training, but I would say it's an ongoing one, because with the King Center, right? Kelisha, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, it's an ongoing thing, and I think we implemented the system, was it 3 years ago? 2 or 3 years ago? Wow. So fortunately, again, we have an assigned DAM administrator, so we receive, that upfront training. But as Neil mentioned, learning is ongoing. So if you subscribe to the idea that learning is lifelong, that certainly applies in this context. So, and it's not because it doesn't have anything to say about the usability of the system. It's simply because our team, is always asking questions and always curious about what we can do and how we can better engage with the system. So fortunately, that training component is always ever present.
Yeah. And just for Natalie, I hope I'm saying your name right, Natalie. Yes, we can support mods as well in our system. So thank you. I think we're running out of time here, Alex.
Yeah, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you, everyone, for your fantastic questions. I think I moved a little too fast on that. If you want to stay up to date on all things Terentia or be notified of our next webinar, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media. Of course, scan the QR code. Thank you again, Dr. Graves, and everyone for attending. If you'd like to stay in touch and learn more about Terentia or schedule a demo, you can scan that QR code down in the corner or reach out to us directly at info@terentia.io. And that concludes our webinar today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. And thanks, Dr. Graves, for joining us again today. It was always fun to spend some time talking about this. And for those who I'm so excited about what we're building with the King Center. What's really important is what we're building with the King Center will be available to other Terentia community members as well after it's been launched. I can't wait for you to see this next digital exhibition that we're doing. It's going to be exciting.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thanks, Dr. Graves.
Thank you, everyone.